So our keynote speaker this afternoon is Ted Nordhaus. Ted is the co-founder and research director of the Breakthrough Institute. He's a leading global thinker on energy, environment, climate, and human development. And the topic of his presentation this afternoon is separating fact from fabulism. Ted, welcome to Michigan.
That'll work. Does that work? Everyone hear me? Thanks. Thanks, Mark, and thanks to the University of Michigan for having me here today. I'm a Berkeley guy, so it's always great to be at another great public university. George Orwell in 1984 famously wrote that who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And while that might have been true in totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, in our aspirational democracy, the inverse is often the case, especially when it comes to energy and the environment. Who controls the future controls the present. Over a half century ago, nuclear advocates promised an energy future that would be too cheap to meter. And what followed was a huge build-out of nuclear plants globally. Born of civil society opposition to nuclear energy, soft energy advocates have promised 100% wind, water, and solar future for almost as long. And recent decades have seen all sorts of massive efforts in terms of mandates and subsidies in various parts of the world to make that future a reality. And neither vision was entirely without prescience. At its peak, at the peak of the nuclear boom, over 20% of US electricity and 18% of global electricity was generated with nuclear power. And while it wasn't too cheap to meter over the full lifetime of the plants that we built, nuclear electricity has proven remarkably cheap. France proved that you can power a modern economy almost entirely with nuclear energy, or at least a modern electrical grid. And with the benefit of hindsight, it also proved that you can achieve rates of decarbonization that are consistent with serious climate mitigation by building nuclear plants. And soft energy advocates also were right about a few things. Modern economies have, in fact, become much more energy efficient. The cost of wind and solar has, in fact, fallen precipitously with decades of deployment. And there are a few economies around the world that have approached 30% or so of their electrical generation with wind and solar. But neither vision has fully delivered on its promise or really gotten anywhere close to its promise. There are few developed economies that are still building new nuclear plants. And while there is a nuclear renaissance of sorts going on in the developing world, in 2015, last year, we brought more nuclear power online than in any year globally since 1990. But that increase in nuclear deployment in the developing world has not been able to keep up with the growth of fossil fuels, which have grown even faster. And similarly, where there's been significant growth at all, wind and solar deployment have consistently stalled as they move beyond about 20% of generation. And it turns out that intermittent wind and solar have their own negative scaling factor, which is that the value of the electricity falls and the cost of integration increase as grid penetrations increase significantly beyond the capacity factors of the intermittent technologies in question. Turns out that energy futures are not so easily bent to utopian dreams. We were promised flying cars. Mark Thiel, who's also a prominent nuclear advocate, Peter Thiel, prominent nuclear advocate, famously observed, and instead what we got was 140 characters. The Jetsons, we are not. And anyone traveling through the California desert or other sites of large-scale renewable development will tell you that soft energy development looks nothing like what you see in the brochure with the languidly spinning windmill amidst bucolic rural landscapes with wilderness off in the middle distance. It looks more like what you see on the right of the screen there. The great thing about the future is that it is shining and weightless and perfectly optimized. The present, by contrast, is complicated and consequential, and history bears heavily on possibilities for the future. So it's no surprise that most of our energy debates are prosecuted in a sort of virtual future. The forecast, the model, the scenario, and the feasibility study are the weapons of choice, and this kind of projection of energy futures really exploded in the 1970s after the oil embargoes. And what we've seen since then are just a huge range of predicted energy futures. And the one common thread that they all share is that they have reliably failed to predict the future. Mainstream forecasters, sorry, got ahead of myself. Mainstream forecasters have, from the 70s onwards, consistently overestimated demand, and they consistently, as Jim noted, overestimated the nuclear build-out, 1,000 reactors. We didn't get anything close to that. Amory Lovins and other soft energy advocates were closer to the mark on demand, but for all the wrong reasons. Slower economic growth, deindustrialization, and saturating demand really accounted for most of the lower energy demand, not technical efficiency, as Amory and others suggested. And Amory was wildly off the mark with his projection of the share of US generation that renewables would account for. He predicted that 33% of US electricity in the year 2000 would be generated with renewables. The actual number was less than 0.5%. So, there are as many proximate reasons that forecasters get energy futures wrong as there are forecasts. But as a general rule, there are sort of four ways that we get these things wrong. The first is that we fail to anticipate major macroeconomic developments, think the rise of China or the collapse of the Soviet Union. The second is that we fail to predict social and technological change, think shale gas and 3 Mile Island. The third is that we project trends that look very robust in the past, sort of in linear fashion, into the future, and that's why forecasters in the 70s so badly overestimated energy demand. And the last thing is that we imagine that energy futures that really constitute a radical break from the evolutionary path that energy systems typically follow. And that's why renewables advocates so badly overestimated the share of renewables in 2000 and continue to do so. Now, each of these failures offers important lessons as we think about what it will take to address the climate challenge. Events like the financial crisis continue to remind us that we are really not good at predicting the macroeconomy at all. And if we can't predict the macroeconomy, we can't predict future energy demand. We're even worse at predicting technological futures. While mainstream forecasters overestimated energy demand and the nuclear build-out and soft energy advocates overestimated the renewables build out. There was broad agreement among almost everyone that oil would be very expensive in the future and that gas would be scarce. Didn't work out that way. And I think the lesson here is one that technological change doesn't happen on schedule, and it often comes from quarters that we don't anticipate. Projecting the past into the future, also a really dangerous game. Trends only look smooth and consistent in hindsight, in reality, in the moment, in the present. They're almost always contingent, variable, and nonlinear. So forecasters who projected demand growth based on the post-war economic and energy boom didn't anticipate the ways that growth would saturate and slow in post-industrial economies. And you see here the decline in industry and services in the US economy and the big shift towards services, which had a huge impact on the energy intensity of the US economy. Projections based on renewables growth, based on scaling rates at tiny levels of deployment make the same mistake. The absolute amount of renewable energy that has to be deployed to sustain the same growth rate at a 5% share of global generation is an order of magnitude larger than what's necessary to sustain the same rate at a 1% share. Finally, if projecting the past into the future is hard, projecting energy futures that represent a dramatic break from the past almost always end in fabulism. Karl Marx, at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, wrote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past." And this is especially true of energy transitions. They are made possible by social, technological, and economic systems already in place, and also drive the transformation of those systems. You can't disentangle coal from the steam engine, railroads, and electricity. You can't separate oil from the internal combustion engine, modern transportation networks, or urbanization. And you have to understand that centralized grids co-evolved with modern cities and industry. As modern economies grew in scale, they became increasingly centralized, as did the energy systems that powered them. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, all energy systems were distributed, decentralized, diffuse, and renewable. Early electrical systems were distributed microgrids. Competition was rampant, and multiple providers competed to offer patchwork service to those who could afford it. The centralized grid and the regulated utility were the critical apps that allowed electricity to transform manufacturing, industry, and urban life in the early years of the 20th century, early decades. And that basic process has continued. Dense fuels and increasingly efficient conversion technologies have made modern energy ever cheaper, more abundant, and available to more sectors of the economy. And for that reason, the long-term evolution of energy systems towards denser fuels and centralized generation and distribution has proceeded in this way. Now, of course, the past is only prologue, and later today, Mark Jacobson is going to suggest to us that these processes, these long-term processes in the evolution of our energy system, are about to reverse. And he will provide statistics, studies, models that show that wind is now cheaper than coal, that energy storage is on the verge of a breakthrough. Soon enough, the world will be powered by diffuse energy gathered over vast landscapes, transmitted over enormous distances, and distributed in decentralized fashion. Now, if you really believe in that future, I don't believe that there are any set of alternative calculations that I can show you that are going to change your mind. And if you're skeptical of that future, I don't think that you need more analysis from me to support your skepticism. But the truth is that the claim is basically unfalsifiable because the truth lies in the future. And even when predictions of this sort end up failing and not proving out, advocates can be reliably counted on to blame ignorance, incumbents, the fossil fuel industry. And I want to make clear this is not just limited to soft energy advocates. Nuclear advocates have created their own rogues gallery of meddling regulators and anti-nuclear fearmongers and, again, the fossil fuel industry. But let me suggest that complaints from all quarters of energy futures delayed and derailed protest a bit too much. New technology and innovation, of course, is always resisted, but energy transitions historically have provided such significant benefits to society and the economy that they sweep all resistance out of their way. Social, political, and economic institutions respond rapidly to capture the benefits of those technologies. Within a decade of Thomas Edison's first electric generating plant at Pearl Street, the benefits of electricity for trolleys and factories was already evident. And similarly, with automobiles and rail transportation, the superior speed, range, hauling capability of first railroads and then automobiles drove a rapid build-out of public and private infrastructure to take advantage of those capabilities. So the story of energy transitions historically has always been a story of new end uses and radical new production efficiencies and possibilities, really reshaping society and reshaping the economy. Now, more recently, the benefits of energy technologies have proven to be less radical, and that probably accounts for why the basic fossil fueled infrastructure, the basic arrangements of that infrastructure, the pipes, the wires, the generation plants, the distribution system have been so durable. Gas initially got purchased in energy markets because it was superior for heating and cooking, and as turbine efficiencies improved quite radically over time, that provided gas with a foothold in electrical generation, particularly because it was flexible. It could follow loads very efficiently and at relatively low capital cost as opposed to fuel costs, which were saved when you didn't operate the turbines. But ultimately, the rapid displacement of, and this all happened was underway even before the shale gas revolution. But ultimately, the rapid displacement of coal after the shale gas revolution with gas was really because it worked with the existing infrastructure. It was plug and play. And the same is basically the case with nuclear. Despite its technological novelty and complexity, it has proven able to displace coal at large scale because it's plug and play with the existing centralized electrical grid. Now, of course, these are precisely the arrangements that renewable advocates have insisted are coming to an end for the last half century, literally, and have argued that this inevitable revolution demands that the entire sector be reorganized around variable renewable energy supply. And while it's true that increasingly today rising variable renewable energy is disrupting the electrical system, we should be clear about why. The continuing expansion of wind and solar is almost entirely dependent on policy and not economics. And I just list here a few of the multiple overlapping and additive subsidies that current renewable generation benefits from: production tax credits, investment tax credits, accelerated depreciation, renewable portfolio standards, net metering, which for people like me in California, the way our net metering is set up is worth at least as much as the federal tax benefits I get for my solar panels, priority dispatch, capacity markets. Each of these measures externalizes the cost of variable renewable energy to other stakeholders: taxpayers, ratepayers, utilities, other generators. And while that is manageable at low penetrations, as penetrations rise, costs rise, and we've seen in a number of places subsidies and mandates scaled back for this reason. And when the subsidies and mandates are scaled back, deployment stalls. Renewable advocates have often celebrated the difficulties that utilities and centralized generators have had, but the truth is they can't live without them, and distortionary policies to drive variable renewable deployment beget further distortionary policies to support their grid integration and the support form of capacity markets and other efforts to keep the backbone of the system operating and economically feasible. Now, of course, one man's distortion is another's disruption, and the transition to fossil energy aided by policy and subsidies was also aided by policies and subsidies, but not at the same scale and not to the same degree. When subsidies stop, so do deployment of renewable sources of energy by and large. And there's no similar analog with fossil. The expansion of the fossil energy system just continued apace pretty, and was pretty robust to the policy environment. Now, I don't want my skepticism of the 100% wind, water, and solar vision to let nuclear advocates off the hook. Because if the idea that we are going to reorganize the entire global economy around variable renewable sources of energy is fantastical, the idea that in response to climate change or some other crisis, we might proceed with a massive French or Chinese centralized build-out of nuclear power is also not particularly plausible. In the same way that the energy system has been evolving over the long term towards greater density and centralization, our political and economic systems have been evolving towards greater democratic governance and liberalized economics. Slow demand growth in the developed world, liberalized electricity markets mean that there are not a lot of utility executives who are ready to make $10 billion 1 gigawatt bets, 60 to 80 year bets on future energy demand in advanced developed economies. And outside of China, South Korea, a few other places, it's not clear that most developed economies have the technology or institutional capacities to support a major build out of conventional light water reactors. So where does that leave us? A half century of failed energy predictions should temper our enthusiasm for sweeping energy visions. And at the same time, climate mitigation requires sweeping technological change. So let me suggest a few principles that we ought to keep in mind as we think about how we should proceed. The first is, do no harm. Nuclear and hydro are still, by a significant margin, the two largest sources of zero carbon generation globally and in the United States. Given the scale of the decarbonization challenge, it's essential that we keep existing nuclear and hydroelectric power online. When advocates claim that we need to close nuclear plants in order to make room for renewables, you can be pretty sure that what's on offer is an ideological project and not a pragmatic climate strategy. But I want to say that the same applies in reverse. Some nuclear advocates concerned about plant closures have suggested that we should end the production tax credit for wind to keep existing nuclear profitable. I would suggest that the key is not to stop deploying renewables, it is to properly value low carbon energy from nuclear. And sensible renewable support should continue so long as it doesn't foreclose other low carbon pathways as well. Second principle, energy demand is going to remain high in absolute terms, even if we can't predict future demand growth with any confidence. And whether it grows faster or slower, the scale of technological transformation necessary to deeply decarbonize the global economy is going to be enormous. Scenarios that envision declining global per capita energy consumption over the coming decades should simply not be taken seriously. The world is going to add another 2 billion people under the best of circumstances. 2 billion people today have no access to modern energy whatsoever. Billions more are unable to consume energy services at levels consistent with the modern living standards that everybody in this room almost certainly takes for granted. So even if energy demand flattens and declines significantly in wealthy nations, global per capita and absolute energy demand is almost certainly going to rise. And we need to be planning for an energy future that can meet that reality. Finally, we don't know the technological future, and we shouldn't overcommit to any particular low-carbon pathway. Well, nuclear advocates and renewable advocates spent the 80s and 90s arguing about which technology constituted the future. An unknown group of entrepreneurs and federal scientists working in national laboratories and for small oil and gas companies figured out how to economically extract natural gas from shale formations. The picture here is George Miller, who's widely credited as the father of the shale gas revolution, with a bunch of his scientists. And the folks who often aren't in the picture are the federal scientists who work really closely with Mitchell Energy and a bunch of other key companies to figure out how to make that work. And what's interesting when you look at the history of the shale revolution is, one, it was just a tiny portion of a much, much larger federal unconventional fuels budget. And actually, most of the money was spent on two technologies that everyone thought were more promising and that failed: synfuels and oil shales, which is not the same as shale oil. Even Mitchell, after he had figured out how to economically extract shale, didn't think that the method could be used in other natural gas formations, and neither did Devon Energy, which had spent billions of dollars to buy Mitchell Energy. They only thought it would work in the Barnett Shale in Texas. And nobody up through the middle of the last decade thought that you could use the same techniques to get oil out of shale formations. So when we think about climate policy and how we mitigate climate change, we need to pursue policies that are sort of basically robust to all of that uncertainty and can support multiple low-carbon technological futures. Now, in some cases, that means literally technologically neutral. A carbon price would obviously make a huge difference for all low-carbon technologies. As I mentioned earlier, we ought to change all of our low-carbon portfolio, our renewable portfolio standards into low-carbon portfolio standards, and if we did it right, we'd really significantly raise the statutory bar for clean energy deployment in this country nationally in the process. But we also need technology-specific policies. Literally every low-carbon technology that we have available today exists thanks to sustained public and targeted support for that technology. So we need to both support specific technologies and do it in a way that it doesn't foreclose other potential decarbonization pathways. Finally, a reminder to my friends in the nuclear advocacy community. Hearts and minds don't necessarily change any faster than technology. And it is not impossible to imagine that renewable and variable renewables might overcome the substantial technological hurdles that they face faster than nuclear will overcome the social, psychological, and institutional hurdles that it faces. If there's going to be a nuclear future at scales consistent with mitigating climate change, reactors are going to have to look really different than the reactors that we have today, and that's going to require a very different nuclear sector. Admiral Rickover is dead, and so is the mid-century state-led nuclear innovation model. An innovative nuclear sector will be a decentralized, a much more decentralized sector, less dominated by large incumbents. It will support a new generation of nuclear entrepreneurs, and that new generation needs new policies. They need to be able to experiment with new combinations of fuels, coolants, materials, and architectures. We need new approaches to licensing. We need national laboratories that can support startups. And we need policies that can support commercialization and scale up of new nuclear designs without putting 4 or 5 guys at DOE in charge of deciding which ones are going to be the future. Broadly, we need public policy to support innovators and not dictate to them, which was the old nuclear, top-down nuclear model. So in closing, I want to kind of pull back again and talk a bit about how we got where we are today in terms of our energy and climate debates. I want to go back before our energy debates became so rancorous, before the oil embargoes of the 1970s spawned a million energy forecasts and scenarios and fantasies. And you can really trace the dispute between nuclear and renewables advocates back to the birth of the New Left and the social discord in the 1960s that followed. And the idea that we would power the whole world with local, renewable, decentralized energy was part of a much broader vision. And the idea was that technologies at smaller scale and that could operate at smaller scale would be more humane, more equitable, and more sustainable. And nuclear energy, for obvious reasons, certainly the large light water reactor technology that was dominant at the time, came to be seen as just fundamentally antithetical to that vision. And this is Amory Lovins writing in his very famous, really seminal essay on the soft energy path in Foreign Affairs. In an electrical world, your lifeline comes from an understandable neighborhood technology run by people who know who you know, who are at your own social level, but rather from an alien, remote, and perhaps humiliatingly uncontrollable technology run by a faraway, bureaucratized, technical elite. And he goes on and on for a couple more paragraphs in this vein. So if you want to understand how our energy debate became so polarized, you have to go back to the values and the ideas that underlie it. But what's interesting is that if you go back to the very beginnings of the New Left, that wasn't so clear. The foundational document for the New Left, for Students for Democratic Society, was written not 100 miles from here in Port Huron. And, you know, curiously, the SDS founders at that time, this was 1962, actually saw nuclear energy as a force for good. They wrote of a future in which America's monster cities might be broken up into smaller communities powered by nuclear energy. And talking about the global development challenge, they called for every nation, support for every nation so that it might build an adequate infrastructure for future industrial growth, and that atomic energy plants would need to spring up along with that infrastructure to make electrical energy available. And that should remind us that energy futures are always proxies for our values. And that when we fetishize particular technologies associated with those futures, it's really easy to lose track of those values. Now, if you actually look at what large-scale renewable development looks like, I mean, it is every bit as centralized as the future that Amory Lovins rejected. I mean, vast wind and solar farms, transmitted across vast distances, remote, alien. You could use virtually every word that Amory used to describe nuclear energy, to describe that future as well. And by contrast, if you look at a lot of the new advanced reactor designs, they're small. Some as small as 3 megawatt reactors. And when you think about it, there's no reason that that kind of reactor couldn't power a decentralized world, much like the one that the founders of Students for a Democratic Society imagined in the early 60s. So in closing, if we take the climate challenge seriously, I think there's a challenge to sort of all of us in the energy and climate space in the debates. And that's one, we need to check our technological priors at the door. A prosperous world is possible, but it's going to require both better renewables and better nuclear technology. We need less heat and more light in our energy and climate debates. And most importantly, we need to abandon this ancient feud and work together to deploy nuclear and renewables as fast as we can. Thank you very much. Okay.
So we have time for a few questions. If you could line up at the microphones. Well, you're close down here. I'll share it.
Okay. I'm John Cush from Terrestrial Energy USA, and I just have one thing I'd love to get your comments on. These are always so electricity focused, and the vast amount of carbon is produced not by electricity, but by all the other processes, cement production, transportation fuels, what have you. So why don't you please comment about how nuclear power, especially the new high temperature, small modular nuclear power, could go a long way towards solving that much bigger part of the equation. And just as a little aside, we worked fairly closely with the Google.org when it existed, and it's gone now for this very reason, that they realized they could distribute 100%, free electricity, and it would do very little to change the carbon footprint.
Thanks. Great question. Yeah, the first thing if you haven't read, there's a article written up in the IEEE Spectrum publication by a couple of the Google engineers, just describing, kind of coming to terms with the fact that their sort of RE less than C effort was really not going to have the kind of impact on carbon emissions that they'd hoped. And you're right, electricity is the easy part. That's why everybody talks about it, because it's actually the part that it's easiest to get it's not easy, it's just easier than really the rest of the energy economy to decarbonize. You can get your head around it, you can look at France, and you can see that we actually really did mostly decarbonize the electrical sector there. And when you start to get to transportation, to heavy industry, to producing fertilizer and all sorts of other really critical uses, it's much harder. I think there are new nuclear technologies that have the potential to address a bunch of that. I think there's also sort of some potential renewable pathways there as well. But I think the important point is that we're really a long way from figuring out how to do any of that. And again, I would be skeptical of anyone who claims that we're anywhere close to knowing how to do it. So it does speak to the scale of the challenge, and I do agree with you. I think advanced nuclear has potential to be one of the key solutions to that problem, but it's a huge challenge.
I'm surprised no one's lining up at the microphones. Yes.
Hi there, David Schoenberger from the Alliance to Halt Fermi 3. And so I heard you spend a lot of time attacking the distortionary subsidies and policies favorable to support renewables. I didn't hear you spend so much time attacking the nuclear industry corporate welfare, the subsidies to the industry that make it feasible economically. I was wondering if you agree with the Union of Concerned Scientists report in 2011 that claimed that in some cases that the subsidies to the nuclear industry exceed the value of the energy produced.
No, I don't agree with that. And I would just point out, we hear what we want to hear. I actually did spend a lot of time calling out nuclear advocates for sort of claims that I think are infeasible or haven't worked out either. I think we should all be asking ourselves, I think we should all be trying to listen a little more carefully rather than win an argument, because I think we spend a lot of time arguing, and I don't think it gets us to pragmatic, sort of practical ways forward. And I think we'd all be well served to spend a bit more time listening.
Hi, my name is Jim McInnes. I'm with the IEEE USA Energy Policy Committee. And before I talk about that, I would also mention in response to that question there, if you look at a study by the Nuclear Energy Institute, most of the subsidies went to fossil fuels, well beyond what's gone to the renewables industry. So I would suggest people look at that. That study came out in 2011. It's a very interesting study from the Nuclear Energy Institute. I was wondering if you had seen the IEEE USA Energy Policy Committee and IEEE Power and Energy Society jointly worked on comments to the QER, the Quadrennial Energy Review. And the recommendations to the President in the QER basically said that the grid would be able to accept 30% intermittent energy with very little problems. Now, this is the electrical engineering community, IEEE Power and Energy Society, with thousands of members of that throughout the world. And I thought that was a pretty good indicator of, well, it may be challenging to bring on intermittency or intermittent renewables into the grid. I think the people that design power plants and the grid feel that 30% shouldn't be too difficult, and I think if we can reach that, there certainly is an opportunity to go beyond that. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that I think if we could get to 30%, it would be a remarkable accomplishment. We should try to do that. I do think that there are pretty significant technical constraints and economic constraints to getting much beyond that. And I certainly wouldn't want to bet our climate future on the fact that we're going to be able to do that, which is why we need a portfolio.
Last question up here.
Hello, Timothy Maloney. What is your opinion of the memorandum of understanding between Thorcon, the company, and the Indonesian thorium consortium for the 1,000 megawatt liquid fuel reactor to be online by 2021? Do you expect that project to be successful?
I hope it will be successful. I wouldn't bet on 2021, but I hope I'm wrong. I do think it's probably, it's unfortunate that, they had to go and license the thing through the Indonesian government because it's so difficult to do any kind of innovative nuclear here in the U.S.
Great. Thank you very much.